It's not uncommon to hear people say, we have problems with our institutions, or we need to reform our institutions. But what are institutions ultimately made up of? People. Fallible people, but people with humanity who can see into the problems of their fellow man and identify themselves in their struggle. But institutions are made to do something that is directly antithetical to that. Institutions are made to take a lot of people, put them together in a sort of mechanical, hierarchical fashion to produce a result that is thoroughly not human, that is divorced from any of the individual feelings of all of the people, the functionaries that make up its mechanical arms. That these systems, or institutions as I'm calling them, that we create, end up having an agenda that is separate from the individuals who make them up, because they are designed in such a way to yield a result that does not represent the individual will of one person working in it, or even the will of the majority of people working in it. Those institutions are built for one thing and one thing only: efficiency. Efficiency is their agenda, to operate as an effective system. And being an effective system is, once again, antithetical many a time to the humanistic, altruistic, or empathic inclinations that we as individual people may have. And it was exactly through this realization that I came to the conclusion that the state, as an institution, is not for the betterment of human life. It is for the advancement of the interests of that very system, a system that is controlled by, or primarily composed of, competing factions of the elite. And these competing factions of the elite, all with their own economic interests, their own cultural biases, which happen to stem from economic interests, they attempt to steer the system in the direction that most suits their industry, or the section of industries that they come from. But at the end of the day, the system is good at perpetuating itself, in the same way that the goal of a gene is to endlessly reproduce, to stay alive. You know, a virus endlessly reproduces, replicates itself. We learned in Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene that ideas do the exact same thing, that their goal is reproduction, self-preservation, and replication. I believe it's the same with systems, and this is the reason why, despite human emotional opposition to many of the reforms undertaken by the system that must be undertaken in order to preserve its hegemony and perpetuate its survival, in spite of that opposition at the human level by its functionaries who are human, it continues to persist, because their job is not to provide human input. Their job is to uphold the status quo. It's to be cogs in this broader machine that you and I are not steering. Democracy itself is not steering the ship. I know I posed a hopeful and optimistic outlook as to how we can reform the Democratic Party into one that leans leftward. And I do genuinely believe in organizing around those means. But look at history. How many times have you seen something like that take place, succeed? Are the hearts and minds of individual people, the constituents, really the determining factor here? Or is it something much broader, much more materialistic in nature, something that spans beyond our individual selves and indeed our lifetimes. I believe that these institutions that we've created have gotten so complicated with the goal of efficiency, with the goal of perpetuating themselves, with the goal of expanding capital and the state bureaucracy ever so far, that we've lost that human element. The individual opinions of the cop or the news anchor or the politician, the individual feelings of all of these people, they do not matter. If anything, they're disruptions to the system's overall plan. If a police officer, for example, strikes a subject that was apprehended against his own code of conduct and the law of the nation, this is going to be a disruption, because trust in the police, who ultimately have the monopoly on violence, who ultimately act as the protectors of private property and of state institutions, trust in them as an institution remains vital, which means that the population cannot see moments of police brutality or moments of police discrimination against other races, because this is bad for the system. And so the system tries to create mechanisms by which this can be undone, that this can be addressed. But those individual figures continue to disrupt in spite of its best efforts. And it makes me think that this broader narrative occurring is kind of a fatalistic one. You know, I truly want to believe that we can march on to a better life, and my definition of a better life is basically, living in a country with policies that benefit someone like me. I am an egoist. I do not believe in morality. The basis of my morality is entirely my own self-interest. And so, it's in my self-interest to have things like good public transit, to have UBI, to have all drugs legalized and harm reduction services for addicts, to have free healthcare for everybody, and social housing that actually wipes out the private market, or outcompetes the private market, socialized banking, and nationalization of key resources and industries and so on. These are things that we've seen occur all throughout the world successfully. The reason they don't happen here is because the material conditions present in this nation are not present in those. Sure, there were large movements of people who pushed for those policies to get implemented there and have continued pushing to keep them there. And when you have policies that universal and that good, they're pretty damn difficult to take away. But most of it isn't people power keeping those things in place. Most of what's keeping those things in place is entirely geopolitical in nature, just like what brought them there. You see, the Soviet Union was around in the 20th century, and the countries that were on the European continent, they knew a lot more about the USSR than we in the US and Canada did, because they knew exchange students from that country, immigrants from that country, and information was getting to them. And they could not have their politicians lie to them about how universal health care or full employment or any of these other great programs are simply impossible. Because all they had to do was look at the Soviet Union and see, well, they're doing it over there, and this is the second biggest power in the entire world. Why can't we have the things that they have? So, their politicians threw up their hands and begrudgingly implemented these socialistic policies, and they've tried their absolute damnedest to roll them back as much as humanly possible ever since the fall of that country. But those things were implemented for primarily geopolitical reasons. Of course, it was the constituency and organized personal pushback from the people, but primarily it was geopolitical in nature, in the same sense that the system in the United States recognized that having Jim Crow was not going to pan out for our geopolitical aspirations on the national stage, on the international stage, when the Soviet Union was going out there and showing images from the Jim Crow South of innocent black men being beaten to death, being lynched, and so on. They brought these images to the United Nations and said, the very simple statement that this large-scale capitalist country that claims to be free and democratic and claims that if it were to influence you in the third world, if you were to take on its model, it would bring prosperity. But does this look like prosperity to you? And of course, many of those non-aligned nations saw that, were horrified, and did not want to make a deal with the US or join a bloc with them. And so the system had to change against the will of the people in the Jim Crow South. The Supreme Court stepped in and decided this has got to go, and Congress jammed through the Civil Rights Act, and that solidified it. It put the cap on it, sealed it shut. That had to go. But I don't think it was the moral inclinations or aspirations of individual politicians, many of whom were incredibly racist in the American Democratic Party and in the American system more broadly. What they recognized was an international precedent being set by the competing power who had Africans attending their universities being treated equally as Russians, and many other visible minority groups who had, relatively speaking, the same rights as everybody else. It was an optical change that needed to be made, but this is how you're able to analyze the various material factors that go into political decisions. Generally, geopolitics, the economic reality in a country, and so on, are going to be the things determining what decisions get made, and those decisions are all in efforts to perpetuate the system. It has nothing to do with your feelings or the feelings of the people operating that system or maintaining it. It is structured in a way by encompassing so many individuals that rather than operating as one big individual, one big brother, so to say, it instead operates as one big machine with no heart to speak of whatsoever. So it's great for me to say that I'm a communist, that in principle I want communistic proposals, but them not working isn't so much contingent on the fact that they've already been tried and they've failed. Them not working is contingent on the fact that here, they never will be tried, because that does not benefit the perpetuation of the state, of the system. The best we can hope for are more milquetoast reforms and perhaps one or two radical bones thrown our way. That's the best we can hope for. I call myself a communist not because I believe that communism will prevail or that the world that I want to see will come to be. I call myself that because I know it's a lost cause, and because my ideal world, the world that I would like to live in, coheres to that lost cause. Not this one. I don't want to live in this world. I want to live in that world. But I'm more than self-aware at how doomed of a proposal that is. Which is why all we can really do is focus on our lifestyles. You know, living as happily as we can, and being as, decent of people as we can, ethically speaking. The political, that's not for us. That's decided for us.